Noon in Dust Valley burned so bright it erased every shadow. The wind came in waves, carrying red dust thick enough to swallow the horizon. When the stagecoach stopped in front of the town's post office, the horses were slick with sweat, and the air smelled of iron and scorched earth. The door opened. A woman stepped down. Her pale blue dress faded with age, sleeves worn thin, the hem frayed and heavy with dust. In her hand was a small cloth bag, light enough to make you pity her, and inside it lay the one thing that had kept her standing through the long journey. A folded letter, the words neat and measured, written by a man she had never met. I don't need love. I need quiet. You'll have a roof, land, and my name, if you agree. Wyatt Hale. That was all. No tenderness, no promise. Yet Amara Fields had read it every night along the way, because sometimes a cold truth is more trustworthy than a sweet lie. The driver set her small trunk down, tipped his hat, and left her standing alone in the street's red dust. Around her, a few people stopped to look. Two women in front of the general store whispered. A man spat tobacco into the dirt. No one smiled. That's the one marrying Silent Wyatt, isn't she? Yeah, poor thing. Amara heard them, but didn't flinch. She was used to whispers, the kind that trailed her footsteps from one town to the next since the day her husband died, leaving her with 2 children and a wound no one could see. She had buried her youngest by the river, sent the other 2 east to her aging mother. The ticket to Wyoming had been bought with mending work and a little mercy from strangers. Each step she took sank into the red earth, her boots collecting dust. In her left hand, she held a plain silver ring, too wide for her finger. She turned it in the light. It didn't fit, but it was real. And maybe something real, even if it didn't fit, was better than a dream that never would. From the saloon across the street came the sound of a piano, off-key, weary, like the last breath of the day. Amara looked around. A small church, a saloon, a dry windmill moaning in the heat. No one waiting. No wagon in sight. She unfolded the letter once more, smoothing the creases. The name Wyatt Hale at the bottom looked carved more than written, like a scar. She'd pictured him dozens of times. Maybe older, maybe injured, or just a man who'd lived too long in silence. You'll find out soon enough, she murmured to herself. Near the post, the sheriff leaned against a wooden beam, hat brim hiding half his face. When she asked for directions to Hale's ranch, he pointed west, voice low. Keep heading past the cottonwoods. You'll see a fence. Nobody crosses that fence unless he says so. Thank you, she said, though he hadn't wished her luck. She started walking. The wind rose behind her, pulling at the blue dress, dragging a curtain of dust. The valley stretched wide and soon, barren. The only sound a hawk's cry slicing through the white sky. Every mile was a question. Who was the man who wrote that letter? And what kind of woman answers it with her life? She thought of Daniel, her eldest, waving goodbye at the station. Come back when you find a home, Mama. His voice echoed inside her like a vow. Maybe this was home. Even if no one waited, even if silence was all that met her. By the time the sun tilted west, she saw it. The wooden fence, glinting in the light, and beyond it, a lone house with a thin line of smoke rising from the chimney, afraid to tear the sky. She stopped at the gate. Her hand brushed the rough wood, then tightened around the ring. It was still too loose, but she slipped it on. The wind pressed the blue fabric to her legs. In that still moment, she heard her heartbeat blending with the wind's low hum. Somewhere beyond that fence, the silent man was waiting. Amara lifted her head, gazing toward the fading light over the hills, and whispered, "If I have to walk into silence to be alive again, then I will." The room where the wedding took place was small and dim, tucked inside the Dust Valley Town Hall. A faded map of Wyoming hung on the wall, its corners yellowed with age. A wooden table, 3 chairs, and a registry book that held the names of those who had bound their lives together here. Marriages signed in black ink and silence. There were no flowers, no music, no witnesses, only 3 people, the judge, Amara, and Wyatt Hale. She wore her pale blue dress again, its collar faded with time. Her hair was tied neatly, a few loose strands falling along her neck. Wyatt stood opposite her, a white shirt with the sleeves rolled, calluses lining his knuckles. His face was sun-darkened, the kind carved from dry earth, and his eyes, still, deep, almost unblinking. The judge spoke the familiar lines in a flat tone, like a man repeating the same vow for the 100th time. "Do you, Wyatt Hale, take this woman, Amara Fields, to be your lawful wedded wife?" Wyatt looked straight ahead, without pause. "I do. Not I will. Not I promise, just I do." Short, cold, but true. When it was Amara's turn, her voice trembled slightly, as if searching for warmth inside words that had none. "I do." A pen scratched. 2 signatures. Then the judge closed the book and said, without looking up, "That's it. You're man and wife." No applause. No congratulations. From the hallway came footsteps and a voice low but clear. "Poor woman, marrying the quiet one." Amara heard it. So did Wyatt. But he didn't flinch. He just gave a brief nod to the judge and walked ahead. She followed, her skirt brushing softly against the wooden floor. Outside, the sunlight burned white on the steps. Passers-by turned to stare. A few women watched her, their eyes caught somewhere between pity and curiosity. A man's voice snickered. "He didn't even kiss the bride." Wyatt stopped for a heartbeat. His jaw tightened, then eased. He didn't turn around, didn't speak, only walked to the wagon. Amara lowered her eyes and followed. In that moment, she understood. This man didn't know how to speak of love, but he knew how not to wound it. They sat across from each other in the wagon. The road out of town was thick with red dust, the wheel tracks carved into the hard earth like hurried lines of fate. Amara held her cloth bag close. Wyatt gripped the reins in silence. The wind blew through, lifting strands of her hair. One brushed his neck. She turned away, embarrassed. He said nothing. But when the horse startled crossing a narrow bridge, nearly throwing her off balance, his hand shot out, firm and fast, steadying her by the shoulder. "I won't hurt you," he said, voice rough, almost like a vow that escaped without thought. She turned to him, startled. In the glare of sunlight, his face was half in shadow, half in gold, his eyes calm, unpleading, without sweetness. Just truth. "I believe you," she said quietly, "because I've already been hurt enough." He faced forward again, said nothing more, but the silence between them changed, no longer hollow, but steady, like 2 breaths finding the same rhythm. Dust Valley faded behind them. The saloon's smoke thinned into the horizon. People turned into shapes swallowed by light. Only two strangers remained, sharing a wagon bound for nowhere anyone could name. The wind carried the scent of dry grass and metal. Amara looked down at her hand, the plain silver ring loose around her finger, turning slightly with the motion of the wheels. She pressed it down, feeling the cool touch of metal against skin. The ring didn't fit, but her heart, for the first time, fit inside this quiet. The road stretched ahead, red and endless. Dust clung to her hair, her shoulders, her memories. She didn't know where she was going, only that the man before her, wordless and worn, carried something in his silence that she wanted to believe in. As the wagon disappeared down the road, the town slipped back into stillness. Red dust rose and swirled around the wheels, and through the soft haze of afternoon light, Amara glanced at her hand again. The silver ring still hung loose, glinting faintly. But for the first time in years, her heart tightened, not in pain, but in life. Wyatt Hale's ranch stood far from town, buried deep in the heart of Dust Valley, a place so wide and still it seemed forgotten by the world. The road leading in was covered in red dust, flanked by tall cottonwoods with bare, pleading branches reaching skyward, begging for rain that hadn't come in years. The house was sturdy, wooden walls, sloped roof, small windows, and solid beams, yet it felt hollow. No curtains, no pictures, no sign of warmth. Everything was clean, orderly, but so silent she could almost hear the dust settling. Amara stepped inside and laid a hand on the table. The rough grain of the wood was cold against her palm. The kitchen held little: a black pot, a few tin plates, a dull knife, and an oil lamp hung slightly crooked. There was no scent of food, no scent of life, only dry wood and rust. Wyatt came in behind her, setting her bag on the floor. His voice was low, hoarse, clipped. "Your room's to the left. Mine's upstairs." Then he turned and walked back outside without another word. The door shut, leaving her alone in a silence thick as fog. Amara took off her gloves and drew a long breath. The wind pushed through the open window, scattering her hair and carrying the sharp sound of grass bending under the wind. She didn't cry. Tears wouldn't give this house a voice. Instead, she started to work. She built a fire from dry kindling, wiped the table, swept the floor, shook out the heavy blanket that smelled of old wood and time. Each motion was slow and deliberate, as if with every sweep of her hand, she was whispering to the house, "I'm here. I exist." Outside came the steady rhythm of hammer and nail, the creak of the barn door. Wyatt worked without pause or word. When his shadow passed the window, it moved like a dark brushstroke across the light. No glance, no nod, only presence heavy and sure. By evening, Amara laid out the first meal: thin soup, cornbread, a small portion of salted meat. Wyatt stepped in, removed his gloves, washed his face in cold water, and sat down. Neither spoke. The knife tapped against tin. The spoon stirred the soup. Their breathing filled the quiet space. Amara sliced the bread and pushed it toward him. Wyatt gave a short nod. No smile, no thanks. Just a slow, honest acknowledgement. She answered with a small nod of her own, fragile but firm. They ate in silence. Outside, the wind brushed the fence, whispering through the dry grass. Inside, the oil lamp flickered, throwing soft light over two faces learning how to exist under the same roof. When the meal ended, Amara gathered the dishes. Wyatt rose and said quietly, his words short as hammer strikes, "I'll tend the barn. You should rest." She nodded. But as he reached the doorway, the lamplight fell across his shoulder, and for a heartbeat he stopped, long enough for their eyes to meet. Just a moment. No words. No change in expression. Yet in that fleeting look, Amara saw something. Not emotion, but recognition. As if, without speaking, he had admitted, "You are here." And that small acknowledgement shifted the house almost imperceptibly. The door closed. The wind returned. Amara sat at the table, watching the weak flame dance in the hearth. It trembled, small and unsteady, but it lived. She thought of Daniel and Matthew, of her promise to bring them home when things were better. Could this place, this house without a voice, this man without words, ever become a home? She didn't know, but a quiet thought took root inside her. Maybe silence is where beginnings grow. That night, Amara lay awake, listening to the wind whistle through the cracks, the horses shifting in their stalls, and somewhere above, the slow, heavy footsteps of Wyatt crossing the wooden floor. Measured, steady, certain. The only sound in the empty house, and within that sound, she realized she was no longer entirely alone. In this vast, wordless world, a small crack had opened in the wall of silence. That morning, sunlight slanted through the small window, scattering a fine layer of gold dust across the kitchen. Amara rolled up her sleeves and opened one drawer after another, wiping each clean. The house was as silent as ever, filled only with the hiss of wind through the cracks and the distant cry of crows over the fields. The top drawer held nothing but empty tin cans, old rope, and a few rusted nails. When she bent to the lower one, her fingers brushed something square, solid, and cold. Amara pulled it out. A worn leather notebook, its edges frayed, its pages yellowed by time. She sat down, brushed off the dust with her sleeve, and opened to the first page. The first line, written in uneven black ink, read, "For when she stays." Her heart stilled. She turned the page. There were no poems, no declarations of love, only a list, plain, practical, precise as hammer strokes. Repair north fence. Build another bed. Buy corn seed. Fix stable roof. Dig second well. Ordinary things. Yet each carried a quiet tenderness that struck deep. Amara drew a long breath. Her fingers trembled as she turned more pages, all filled with Wyatt's handwriting. The man who barely spoke, who worked from dawn to dark without a word, had written plans for when she stayed. Not if, when. As if he believed, or hoped, that someday someone would choose not to leave him. Tears welled, but she held them back. She closed the notebook and slipped it back into its place. She didn't want him to know she'd found it. Some secrets didn't need to be spoken. They were most beautiful when kept between two hearts learning to listen to each other. By late afternoon, the sun fell low outside. Wyatt was in the barn, the rhythm of sawing wood echoing steady and calm. Amara carried a basket of eggs and walked toward the sound. The barn door was slightly ajar. Inside, Wyatt sat on a long beam, sharpening a knife, each motion slow and certain. Sweat darkened his shirt. Sunlight glinted off his tanned arms. In front of him lay a smooth plank of wood, already taking shape, with gentle curves like the side of a child's cradle. Amara paused at the threshold, watching him for a long moment. Then she spoke softly, as if afraid to disturb the air. "What are you making?" Wyatt started slightly, turned his head. His gaze met hers, unsure for an instant. "Nothing," he said shortly. Amara stepped closer, her eyes fixed on the wood. She set the basket down, ran her fingertips along the polished grain, then smiled, a small, tender smile edged with teasing. "You're not very good at lying, Wyatt Hale." His eyes flickered, breath halting for half a beat. No protest, no explanation. He just looked at her, then lowered his head and went back to sharpening. But in that fading light, Amara saw it, the smallest shift. His silence no longer felt wooden and cold. It was warmer now, alive, as if something within him had been quietly touched. She stepped outside, leaving behind the soft hum of saw and blade, and the scent of pine rising with the wind. Her heart beat faster, but lighter, as though she'd glimpsed a hidden part of him he didn't yet know how to show. That night, in her small room, Amara sat by the window and wrote in her own journal. "Today I found a secret. He works for something he cannot yet name. Perhaps love begins not with hope, but with fear. Fear that someone will leave." Outside, the wind mingled with the faint sound of hammering from the barn. Moonlight spilled over the quiet house, silvering the walls that had known only silence. And in that pale glow, Amara felt something rare. The sense that, for the first time, this house was not just occupied, but seen. After days of rain, Dust Valley came alive with a rare wash of green. Wild grass reached to the knee, soft and new, and the narrow creek that cut across the valley had turned into a rushing ribbon of water. It gurgled and splashed against the rocks, catching the sunlight like shards of broken glass. Each morning, Amara went down to fetch water with a small wooden bucket. The path sloped along the ridge, damp, slick, overgrown with wet grass. She knew it well by now. But that morning, when the air was still and the creek lay smooth as glass, reflecting the pale sky and the distant line of mountains, she slowed her steps, caught by the beauty of it. One wrong step, a slip of stone. The ground tilted beneath her. Amara gasped. The bucket flew from her hand, tumbling into the stream. Cold water splashed up her legs and tugged hard. She grasped a branch, slippery with moss, but the mud gave way and the roots tore loose. For one breathless instant, the world spun. Then a hand caught her arm, hard enough to sting. Wyatt. He came charging down the slope, boots striking mud, water bursting around him. His grip was iron. With one powerful pull, he hauled her up, both of them collapsing together onto the bank. Mud splattered. The chill bit deep. Their breaths tangled in the space between them. Amara lay still for a moment, her heart pounding wild. When she opened her eyes, his face was inches away, droplets sliding from his temple down the hard line of his jaw, catching the light before falling to his collar. His breathing was sharp, his eyes bright and wide, like a man who'd just stared over the edge of something too dark to name. He was still holding her hand. His grip trembled slightly, not from cold, but from fear. "Wyatt," she whispered, breath uneven. "I'm all right." He didn't answer. His gaze stayed on her face until she nodded. Only then did he release her, rise to his feet, and step back into the stream to retrieve the drifting bucket. When he returned, soaked through, Amara was still sitting in the grass, dress streaked with mud, fingers clutching at the blades. She wanted to speak, but her throat closed around the words. For the first time, his silence didn't feel distant. It felt like a place she could breathe in. Wyatt handed her the bucket. His voice came rough, damp with the river and the rush of his own restraint. Be careful. Amara looked up at him, lips trembling, then laughed softly, a quick, bright sound, like sunlight breaking through clouds. Too late for that. Wyatt froze, caught off guard. The corner of his mouth twitched. Not quite a smile, but the tension eased from his eyes. The wind stirred, her hair brushed against his chest, and for a brief heartbeat, their rhythms matched. They walked home side by side. The path was long, their clothes heavy with water, the hem of her dress dragging, his boots squelching in the mud. Neither spoke, yet every step seemed to pull them closer. At the gate, Amara paused. You came so fast, she said quietly, her eyes drifting toward the river. How did you know I was there? Wyatt tightened his grip on the horse's reins, his voice low and plain. I looked out the window. Didn't see you. So simple. Yet within those 5 words, Amara heard everything. The quiet panic of a man who'd lost too much to risk losing again. She nodded, smiling faintly, and walked up to the porch. He followed, silent, but when she turned to close the door, he was still there, standing in the yard, watching her, the light fading around him. That night, as she mended the torn seam of her now dry dress, Amara heard the sound of his footsteps passing through the parlor. Slow, steady, certain, the rhythm of someone making sure she was still there. She whispered to herself, the smallest smile curling at her lips. Too late, Wyatt. I'm already staying. Outside, the wind brushed through the fence rails, and the creek whispered softly in the dark, a thank you carried by the current. For the first time since arriving in Dust Valley, Amara felt truly saved. Not just from the water, but from the quiet loneliness she'd nearly drowned in all her life. That afternoon, wind moved through the cottonwoods, carrying the scent of fresh-cut wood and the soft rhythm of hammer strikes. Amara was folding a stack of linens when she heard it, the steady sounds from the barn, the saw's rasp, wood meeting wood, the patient cadence of work. She wiped her hands and stepped outside. The barn door stood partly open, resin and sun mingling in the air. Light streamed through the slats, striping the floor in muted gold. At the center of the room, something made her stop. A cradle. Finished. Its frame smooth and rounded, the curved runners shaped strong and sure, each joint sanded and fitted with quiet care. Inside it lay a small blanket, pale blue, stitches uneven but made with effort. Amara froze, her hand pressed to her chest. Her throat tightened. Slowly, she stepped closer, her fingers trembling as they brushed the wood. The varnish was still warm, the scent of pine clean and sweet. She gave the cradle a gentle push. It rocked softly, creaking like the breath of a soul not yet born. Footsteps sounded behind her. Wyatt stopped in the doorway, his shadow long against the dirt floor. Amara turned. Her eyes glistened. When did you make this? She asked, her voice breaking. He stood silent for a beat, then answered, low and rough as wind against boards. Since the day you said yes. The words struck deep. Tears slipped down her cheeks, falling onto the polished wood. She sat beside the cradle, hands clasped tight. Wyatt, she whispered, breath shaking. I was pregnant once more, after Daniel and Matthew. But that child never cried. I've never told anyone. I was afraid of pity, afraid they'd see me as a broken mother. Wyatt said nothing. He stepped closer, knelt before her. His shadow swallowed half the fading light. When he finally spoke, his voice rasped, almost a whisper. I know. Amara looked up, startled through her tears. You knew? He nodded slowly. I saw it in your eyes, when you looked at the old cradle I never finished. The way your hand went to your stomach, even when there was nothing there. I only guessed. And I made this one, because I thought maybe someday you'd want to try again. His voice caught on the last word, cracking into breath. Amara began to cry, not the cry of loss, but of being understood. She reached out and laid her small hand over his rough one on the cradle's edge. Wyatt didn't pull away. They stayed like that for a long time, in the slanted gold light slipping through the boards. His face, lined, weathered, sun-browned, softened into something almost gentle. Amara spoke quietly, afraid the wind might take the words away. You don't have to make peace for me, Wyatt. Not for my past. Not for yours. This cradle, it's for us. He looked at her, his gaze unsteady, then tender. For us, he repeated, as if carving it into his heart. She smiled through tears. In that smile lived grief, release, and something new beginning to bloom. Wyatt lifted his hand and touched her cheek. Light, uncertain. Her skin was warm beneath his calloused fingers. Her breath trembled. The space between them vanished, not with urgency, but with recognition. No one moved first. It was just breath meeting breath, eyes holding too long. Then he leaned in. The kiss came slow, awkward, trembling, afraid to break what had finally begun to heal. But with every heartbeat, it grew steadier. More real, not fire, but finding. That night, rain drifted softly against the roof. The house glowed with the low, golden light of a single lamp. Two souls, once strangers, once lost in their own silence, lay in each other's arms. No frenzy, no rush, only warmth, the kind that says you can rest now. Not lust, but shelter. In the barn, the wooden cradle rocked gently in the wind, the blue blanket shimmering under the lamp's glow. It was no longer just an object. It was a beginning. The place where sorrow was soothed, and two wandering hearts learned to speak to each other in silence, without ever feeling alone again. Morning settled gently over Dust Valley after the night's rain. The ground was damp, the scent of young grass rising from the slopes, and dew clung to the barbed wire, glittering like tiny mirrors under the sun. Wyatt had gone out early, sleeves rolled, pliers and a coil of wire in hand, walking the north fence line to mend what the storm had torn down. Amara stood by the window, watching his figure move along the ridge. Since that night of rain, something had shifted quietly between them, not spoken, but felt in the softened glances, in the silences that no longer froze. When she brought him coffee, he only nodded, gave a faint, rare smile, and went back to work. She returned to the house and began the laundry. But near noon, a sound broke through the calm, the sharp clang of metal, followed by a strangled breath, then silence. Amara dropped the basket and ran. Wyatt was crouched by the fence, his left hand gripping his right wrist, blood dripping steadily into the dirt. A strand of barbed wire had looped tight around his arm, tearing deep into the skin. "Wyatt!" she cried, falling to her knees beside him. He shook his head, voice hoarse. "Just a scratch." "A scratch doesn't bleed like this," she snapped, but her voice trembled. She tore her neck scarf in half, took his arm, and began prying the wire loose from his flesh. The last barb came free with a wet sound, and blood surged harder. Wyatt clenched his jaw, saying nothing. Sweat glistened along his temple, veins tight across his forearm. He was a man used to pain, used to silence, as if his body had learned to endure what his heart could not say. Amara bound the wound, her fingers sticky with his blood. "You don't have to pretend you're made of iron," she whispered, eyes steady on his hand. Wyatt bowed his head, breath quick. "I'm fine." She looked up sharply, meeting his gaze. "You can say it hurts, Wyatt. No one will think less of you." He went quiet, eyes darkening, before finally exhaling two simple words. "It does." Just that. But the sound of it cut through the silence like truth breaking open a locked door. The first confession, not of sin but of pain, both flesh and soul. Amara froze. She could feel his pulse beneath the cloth, beating against her palm, matching the rhythm in her own chest. She didn't let go, she just sat there, letting the warmth pass between them. Neither spoke. Only the wind whispered through the grass, and a bird sang somewhere above the fence. When the bleeding slowed, Amara said softly, "There, done. You should rest." Wyatt looked at her, and for the first time his eyes gentled, as if, after all these years, he'd finally allowed someone to touch what was fragile inside him. "Thank you," he murmured. She shook her head, smiling faintly. "Next time, don't say you're fine when you're not." A small, surprised laugh escaped him, rough and rare, a sound so brief it made the sut air itself pause. Later, as the sun dipped low, Amara sat on the porch washing the blood-stained cloth in warm water. Wyatt rested on the steps beside her, arm bandaged in white. The sunset burned gold across his hair, softening the hard lines of his face. She asked quietly, "You always do everything alone, don't you?" "Always?" "Because you don't trust anyone?" He was silent a long time before answering. "Because no one ever stayed long enough to help." Amara set the cloth aside, looked up at him. "Well, now someone has." He turned toward her. Their eyes met in the fading light. There were no walls left between them, only breath, slow and shared, as if one wrong word might shatter the peace they'd built. Wyatt's gaze dropped to her hands, the ones that had cleaned his wound, still faintly stained red. He seemed about to speak, but instead he exhaled, closing his eyes. In that fragile stillness, love took form, not through a kiss or a promise, but through a wound, a touch, and the truth of it does. When the sun sank completely, Amara rose, gathering the basin and heading inside. Wyatt watched her go, his bandaged hand pressed to his chest where the ache lingered. Tender now, no longer sharp. For the first time, pain felt like something worth keeping. The first night of autumn carried a chill that slipped through every crack in the walls. Amara was clearing the dinner table when she heard a commotion from the chicken coop, the flap of wings, the shrill cries of panic. She rushed to the porch just as Wyatt came running from the yard, an oil lamp in his hand. A red fox, large, quick as an arrow, had already seized a white hen and was dragging it toward the dark beyond the fence. Wyatt hurled the lamp to the ground. Firelight flashed across his face as he drew his gun. But the fox vanished into the trees before he could soar. He bent, lifted the limp hen by its wings, blood dripping into the dirt. His jaw was tight, his eyes distant, not with anger, but with memory. Amara stood on the porch, her voice low. "It's just a chicken, Wyatt." He didn't answer. He only fetched a coil of wire and a steel trap, rolling up his sleeves as he headed toward the hill behind the house. She hesitated a moment, then grabbed a shawl and a lantern and followed. The trail was narrow and slick with mud. Her light caught the fresh prints of his boots, pressed deep in the earth. She could hear him ahead, his steps steady, driven, as if he were running from something buried inside. When she reached the crest, she found him kneeling beneath an old oak, setting the trap along the stream's edge. His breath came hard, sweat gleaming on his temple despite the cold. The lantern light flickered over him, and behind his shoulder, she saw something that stopped her. A small grave, unmarked. Just a rounded stone with rough knife scratches across its surface, and a strip of faded cloth tied to a branch above it, fluttering softly in the wind. Amara's voice trembled. "Wyatt, who is this?" He didn't move. After a long silence, his voice came rough, torn from deep within. "My brother." She froze, gripping the handle of the lantern. "What happened to him?" Wyatt bowed his head. 16. There was a storm. The creek flooded. His words came in halting pieces. "I was on the other side. I could have jumped in, but I didn't." The wind stirred, carrying the smell of wet earth and fallen leaves. The flame shuddered, throwing shadows across his face, half light, half dark. "I heard him calling," Wyatt said, voice cracking. "But I was afraid. The current was too strong. Then, silence. They called it an accident. But I know. I was a coward. I haven't slept easy since. Not when the water runs." He lifted his gaze toward the creek, where moonlight glimmered on its restless surface. His eyes were empty, the eyes of a man who had lived too long inside his own punishment. "The cradle," he murmured. "I built it to remind myself that something can still be saved. If I ever have the courage to reach again." Amara said nothing. She set her lantern down and stepped closer, placing a hand on his shoulder. He flinched at first, as though he'd forgotten the gentleness of touch, but then his shoulders eased, the tension draining slowly away. Her hand rested there, warm through the rough fabric. No comfort words. No, it wasn't your fault. Just presence. After a while, Wyatt spoke again, barely above a whisper. "I've never told anyone. Couldn't stand the look they'd give me." Amara's voice came soft but steady. "I don't see you that way." He turned toward her. Moonlight caught his eyes. Weary, wounded, but at last, at peace. They stood there beside the grave, the stream whispering by, the faint cry of a fox echoing somewhere in the hills. Amara bowed her head, murmuring something only the wind could hear. A prayer for the dead and for the living. When she looked up, Wyatt was watching her. His gaze no longer haunted, but lit by a fragile, flickering warmth, like fire struggling against the night. On the way back, neither spoke, but when Amara stepped through the fence, Wyatt stopped behind her, glancing at the bandage on his arm. The wound ached, but it no longer felt like punishment. It felt like proof that he could still feel, still be forgiven. That night, under the pale moon, the silent man was finally seen, not by the eyes of judgment, but by a kindness so gentle it could have been the wind itself. That afternoon, the sky over Dust Valley darkened as if someone had spilled ink across it. The wind rose sharp and heavy, whipping through the cottonwoods until their leaves spun in frantic spirals. Far off, thunder rumbled, lightning split the horizon, and the ground itself seemed to pulse, the heartbeat of some wild thing ready to break loose. Amara stood on the porch, watching the storm swallow the last of the daylight. Wyatt was out in the fields, fighting to tie down the tarpaulin over the grain shed. The wind tore at him, flattening his shirt to his back. The rope snapped from his grasp. She shouted, but the storm devoured her voice. A flash of lightning struck close. The ground shuddered. Wyatt turned, motioning for her to stay inside. But she ran anyway, skirts whipping around her legs, the oil lamp clutched to her chest. She reached him just as the rain came, hard, cold, blinding. "You can't do this alone," she yelled, gripping one corner of the flapping tarp. Wyatt tried to pull it from her, to finish the job himself, but the wind was too strong. Both were thrown to the muddy ground. She landed against his arm, breath colliding with his. When she lifted her head, her hair clung to his cheek. Rainwater streamed down their faces. For one suspended moment, they simply looked at each other. Two figures caught between thunder and light, stripped of everything but truth. Wyatt pulled her to her feet, caught her hand, and led her toward the house. They stumbled through the storm, each step a battle against the wind. When the door slammed shut behind them, the outside world fell to a distant roar. He went to the hearth, hands trembling as he struck the match. She knelt beside him, adding logs until the flames leapt up, painting their faces in shifting gold and shadow. The house seemed to breathe again, warmth seeping into the cold corners. Wyatt stared into the fire, his voice low and frayed. "I've lived behind fences too long," he said, as if confessing to the flames. "I built them so no one would see me, but it kept me from seeing anyone too." Amara said nothing. The wind howled against the windows, the rain hammered the roof, but inside the only sound was the fire's slow crackle. She watched him, her voice quiet when it came. "Then let me in." He turned to her. Firelight flickered in his eyes, the eyes of a man still haunted, yet softened by something new, something almost human again. "I don't know how," he murmured. "You don't have to," she said gently. "Just open the gate." He held her gaze for a long time, until the flames sank low. Then he stood, crossed the room, and unlatched the door. The wind burst in, cold, wild, carrying the scent of rain and earth. He didn't flinch. He let it touch him, let it soak into the fabric of his shirt, into his skin. Amara joined him, laying her hand on the door beside his. "Sometimes," she said, "you open it not to let someone in, but to let yourself breathe." He didn't answer. But when she slowly pushed the door closed again, his eyes had changed, no longer hollow, but clear, as though he'd finally caught sight of the man he'd been searching for. They returned to the hearth. Wyatt sat, the glow of the fire soft on his face. Amara sat beside him, rubbing her hands together for warmth. Outside, the storm raged on, but the heat between them spread quietly, steadily. After a long silence, he spoke, so softly She leaned close to hear. I've grown used to silence, Amara. It used to protect me. Now it feels like a cell. She smiled faintly. Then let's make it our language. He lifted his head, meeting her eyes. No words, just a calm, steady gaze, warm as the coals in the fire. She took the blanket from the chair, spread it across their knees, and moved closer. Their warmth blended, slow and sure. On the wall, the firelight cast slow drifting shapes, the rhythm of breath, of presence, of two hearts at rest. They didn't need to speak. The silence that once divided them had become their way of staying. Outside, the storm still battered the valley. But inside that small house, a gate had opened. Not out in the yard, but deep within. That day, Dust Valley was busier than usual. Wagons lined the street outside the blacksmith's, iron clanging against iron, voices rising above the dry wind. Amara walked beside Wyatt. She needed salt. He needed tools for the fence. Since the storm, something steady had settled between them. Not a promise, but the quiet certainty that neither would leave. They had just stepped out of the store when a hoarse voice cut through the noise from across the street. Wyatt Hale! Goddamn murderer! Wyatt stopped dead. The words sliced through the air like a blade. A man stood in the doorway of the saloon, drunk, shirt half open, bottle swinging from his hand. His face was flushed, his eyes blurred with liquor but burning with hate. You killed your own brother, then hid in that God-forsaken valley to rot. The street fell silent. People stopped and stared. A woman pulled her child away. Someone else stepped back into a doorway. Their eyes turned toward Wyatt, not curious now, but condemning. Amara looked up at him. His face had gone pale, his jaw locked tight. But he didn't answer, didn't move, didn't deny it. He just stood there, still and silent, as if he'd been waiting for that sentence to be spoken out loud. The drunk shouted again, louder. You think silence can wash your sin clean? The water took that boy, and you just watched. The words hit the dirt like a hammer strike. Wyatt turned away, his voice low, exhausted. Let's go, Amara. She followed, her gaze lingering on the shouting man as they walked down the road. Behind them, the drunken cries carried through the wind, long and bitter, like a curse that refused to fade. The ride home was quiet. The wheels rolled over the dry ground, dust curling behind them. It wasn't until sunset that Wyatt finally spoke. He was right. Amara turned, frowning. You don't have to. No, let me. His voice was rough, hollow as wind through wood. I was 19. My brother Jacob, he was 16. He could swim better than anyone. He jumped into the creek to fetch a bucket I dropped. The current caught him. He called out. I was on the other side. I could have gone in, but I didn't. I was afraid. I thought the water would throw him back to shore like it always did. He paused. The wind lifted a fine layer of dust around the wheels, but it didn't. He never came up. I ran along the bank until I couldn't see him anymore. When we found the body, my mother looked at me like I was a stranger. My father didn't speak again, so I left. Buried him on the hill behind the house. And since that day, I've lived like I died with him. Amara said nothing. She just listened, hands gripping the folds of her dress. The valley wind whistled through the dry grass. A cold, steady sound. After a long silence, she reached over and took his hand. Rough, scarred, trembling slightly. Her voice was quiet but firm. Wyatt, you can't save the past, but you're killing yourself by reliving it. He turned toward her. The last light of dusk flickered in his eyes. Then stop dying for it, she whispered. The words were soft but struck clean through the stillness. Even the wind seemed to pause. Wyatt met her gaze, and for the first time something broke, not in pain, but in release. He didn't smile. He didn't weep. He only nodded, as if a chain inside him had finally loosened. When the wagon reached the northern fence, the wheels squealed to a halt. One section of barbed wire, the same place where Wyatt had once been cut, hung broken, dragging on the ground. He climbed down, lifted the loose strand, and stared at it for a long time. Then, instead of mending it, he unlatched the gate and left it slightly open. Amara watched from the seat, understanding without a word. That fence, the wall he had built around himself, now had a way through. Wyatt looked up. The sunset washed his face in weary gold. "Thank you," he said, so softly it was almost a breath. Amara stepped down, came to stand beside him. She didn't answer. She just placed her hand on the wooden gate and pushed, opening it wider. They stood there together, between the wind and the dying light, before a gate that no longer trapped the past, but led somewhere new. Somewhere the living could begin again. Winter came early that year. Snow lay heavy on the roof, falling in soft ribbons, white and quiet as the earth's own breath. The road to town was sealed in ice, but inside the wooden house in Dust Valley, warmth rose from the fire, from soft laughter, and from two steady breaths moving as one. Amara stood by the stove, her hand resting on her belly. The thick wool sweater hid the curve that had grown rounder each week. Firelight glowed across her face, gentle, radiant, carrying that quiet light that only a mother-to-be could hold. The smell of bread mixed with burning pine, settling into corners that once knew only emptiness. Outside, Wyatt split wood. The rhythm of the axe echoed slow and sure, blending with the whisper of falling snow. He was no longer the silent man she'd met months ago. Still quiet, yes, but his silence now was softer, steadier, like a coal that glowed under ash. When he stepped inside, the wind followed him in, cold and biting, before the heat of the room chased it away. He hung his coat, came closer to the fire. Amara turned, smiling. "Cold out there?" He shook his head. "Not in here." His voice was low, rough-edged, a sound that seemed to come from deep within his chest. Amara set the tray of bread on the table. "Sit, before it cools." He sat on the long bench, took the plate she offered, but his eyes stayed on her, open, unguarded, almost tender. Since her pregnancy, Wyatt had grown more careful than she'd ever imagined. He sealed the doors, patched the roof, checked the rafters before each snowfall. He lined the attic floor so no board would creak, and filled every crack that might let the cold through. A man who once trusted no one now spent his days making the world safer for her. They ate by the fire. Outside, snow drifted against the windows, each flake tapping the glass like a quiet greeting. Wyatt looked up, the orange light flickering in his dark eyes. He spoke slowly, every word deliberate. "You know, Amara, you brought my voice back." Amara paused, glanced up. "Your voice never left, Wyatt." He shook his head slightly, smiling faintly. "No, I just forgot how to use it. I thought silence was the only way to survive. Then you came along, and suddenly, I wanted to speak again. For a long moment, she held his gaze. The fire danced in her eyes, deep, clear, full of spring water warmth. You were never voiceless, she said softly. You just needed someone willing to listen. He didn't reply, only lowered his head. After a while, he reached across the table, his rough hand brushing against hers. His skin was cold, hers warm, opposites meeting, and not letting go. They sat that way, wordless. The sound of snow, the hush of wind, the faint crackle of wood. The house was no longer a shelter for two lost souls, but a home, where life was quietly returning, drawn from what had once been broken and what was still waiting to begin. Night fell. Amara added more logs to the fire, the flames flaring up again. Wyatt leaned back in his chair, watching her move in the soft light. She moved carefully now, one hand at her belly, the other holding a lamp. Each small motion of hers unraveled another knot inside him. The tight rope of guilt he'd carried for years, now loosened into a thread connecting them both. She stopped by the window, looking out at the snow-covered fields. It's going to be a long winter, she said quietly. Wyatt came beside her, resting a hand on her shoulder. That's all right, he said. I'm not afraid of winter anymore. She turned toward him, smiling, eyes shining with the warmth of both fire and tears. Outside, the wind swept softly across the open fence. The snow kept falling, but inside the small house the fire burned bright, strong enough to warm the parts of them that had once gone cold. That winter, Dust Valley wasn't cold at all, because inside two hearts that had once wandered alone, love had found its way home, quiet, steadfast, and burning through the night. Spring returned to Dust Valley like forgiveness from the earth itself. The snow melted slowly, trickling into clear streams that wound through new green shoots. The wind carried the scent of damp soil, wildflowers, and sparrows singing under the eaves. In the wooden house on the hill, a newborn cry broke the morning, sharp, bright, alive. Amara lay on the bed, hair damp with sweat, her hand gripping the sheet. Soft light streamed through the window, painting her face in gold as warm as honey. Beside her, Wyatt leaned forward, his rough hands trembling as they held the tiny life that had just entered the world. It's a girl, he whispered, voice shaking. Amara smiled through tears. Clara, she murmured. Her name is Clara. Wyatt sat at her side, staring at the child squirming in the blanket, eyes still closed, lashes trembling like moth wings. He touched her tiny hand with his finger, and she curled it tight around his. The simple, sacred weight of that touch cracked something open inside him. It felt like his whole life had been waiting for that moment. After that day, the house was never quiet again. Crying, laughter, footsteps, Amara's soft singing, all of it wove together into something new, the sound of life. Each morning, Wyatt rose early to light the fire and brew coffee before heading out to the yard to mend fences. He no longer locked the gate. Sometimes the postman stopped by, sometimes a neighbor child came to beg for bread. The front door stayed open most days, letting the scent of baking and laughter drift into the valley. One golden afternoon, a wagon rolled up to the gate. Two boys climbed down, each clutching a small bag, Daniel and Matthew. Amara heard the call, "Mama!" and ran outside. Her skirt swept through the sunlight as she crossed the yard, dropping to her knees just in time to catch them in her arms. They were taller now, shoulders strong, but in her embrace they were small again, safe again. Wyatt watched from the porch, smiling. He stepped forward, bowing slightly in greeting. Daniel looked up at him, uncertain. "Are you?" Amara took her son's hand, her voice gentle. "This is your father." Wyatt froze. For a moment, the world seemed to still. Then Daniel stepped closer, offering his hand. "Can I call you Pa?" Wyatt couldn't answer right away. He only nodded, hard enough that his shoulders trembled. That evening, the house was filled with laughter. Matthew chased the puppy through the yard. Daniel helped Wyatt stoke the fire. Amara sat by the window, humming softly, while Clara slept in the cradle beside her. In that light, warm and quiet, everything that had once been lost seemed to return, not as miracles, but as the reward of hands that had refused to stop building. The old wooden cradle still stood near the hearth. The pale blue blanket faded but sweet with the scent of sun and time. Sometimes Wyatt ran his fingers along its edge, not haunted anymore, but grateful. It was no longer a reminder of what he'd lost, but of what he'd learned to keep. When night fell, they gathered by the fire. Clara slept in her cradle, Daniel and Matthew leaning against each other nearby. Amara rested her head on Wyatt's shoulder, her voice barely above a breath. "We found peace." Wyatt placed his hand over hers, eyes drifting toward the moonlit hills beyond the window. "No," he said quietly. "We built it." The words settled in the room, blending with the soft crackle of firewood, the even breaths of sleeping children, and the faint hum of wind through the open fence. Outside, Dust Valley glowed under the last light of spring. The breeze slipped through the open door, stirring the curtain, carrying with it the smell of earth, flowers, and laughter from the little wooden house on the hill. That house had once known only silence. Now it was full of life. And as the evening faded into gold, their story, two souls once broken, afraid, and lost, didn't end with goodbye, but with the gentlest sound in the world, the laughter of a family. If this story warmed your heart, if it reminded you of someone who once stood beside you through life's storms, leave a comment below. And don't forget to like and subscribe, so each night we can sit together once more, sharing stories from the Wild West, where love still lives, steady as fire in the dark.